We sat the wrong way around once.
Order. We are now in public session, and I welcome the Commissioner of Standards, the Registrar and the Head of Investigations for the Commissioner's Office to this public session of the first meeting of the Committee on Standards of 2026. Commissioner, would you like to make a statement?
Thank you, Chair. There's nothing particular I wanted to add to the annual report I made that the committee may want to ask me about. But as you say, I'm here with the Registrar and with the Senior Complaints and Investigations Manager. And since you offer me the opportunity to open, it's helpful for me to be able to open by recording. I have a small team. They are phenomenally dedicated. They support me exceptionally well, and I know the whole committee is grateful for this annual opportunity to express thanks on behalf of Parliament to my entire team.
That's very helpful. Thank you very much, Commissioner. Well, we were 15 months into the new Parliament elected in 2024 before a case was referred to the committee for consideration of a breach. What conclusions, if any, do you draw from that on how the new Parliament has been working?
Well, I think one thing I would say is there's a certain amount of activity under the surface, and the standing orders and the procedural protocol provide for quite a lot to happen without anything coming to the committee. Indeed, the committee is working at its best when no cases come to the committee. One of the things that standing orders gives me the power to do is to advise members. And I and the Registrar and his team spend a lot of time giving advice to members in advance. We can't give retrospective advice, but prospective advice on what the code means, how the guide should be applied to their particular cases. I seriously welcome that. And the gap that you're talking about, there's not nothing happening. There was a lot of advice, new members and some returning members asking for advice. Like all regulators, I very much prefer to support members in good practice than to assist the committee in punishing bad practice. So I think one of the things I take from that gap is that a lot of good activity has been going on in terms of explanations, advice, and all the regulatory activity that I oversee on behalf of the House.
Thank you, Commissioner. The Times reported your interview with Times Radio on the 23rd of November, saying that you had said, and I quote, there had been no radical change in MPs' conduct since Labour came to power. What did you mean by that?
So what I have to look at is whether there are what I would call atmospheric changes in the kind of cycle that you're talking about, number of cases, number of requests for advice, and number of breaches, some of which, as the committee knows, in accordance with standing order, I do have sometimes the power to give confidential words of advice in relation to matters where there may have been a breach, but that will never come to the committee and it will never be published, which is what the committee has arranged. So I was asked whether I thought that before and after the general election there had been an atmospheric change, and based on my feeling of the kind of questions I get, the kind of complaints I get from members of the public, the kind of activity that I'm carrying out, I said I didn't think there had been.
Thank you, Commissioner. If we can now move to a question from Michael Wheeler. Michael.
Thank you, Chair. So you've stated that your office received 2,955 written allegations and inquiries in the year 24-25, but that resulted in 15 Code of Conduct inquiries. What can the House and you and your office do to address the public misperception of what your office is for?
So, firstly, a lot of the inquiries that I get, or complaints that I get, may not, a lot of them obviously don't result in investigation. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're misdirected. The procedural protocol sets 3 tests for me before I open a public investigation. The first is whether there is sufficient evidence of a breach. The second is whether an investigation would be justified. And the third is whether an investigation would be proportionate. I think it's fair to say I receive a lot of complaints that are within scope of my role, but aren't sufficiently evidenced. Now, sometimes that's because people haven't done the necessary work to acquire the evidence. Sometimes because they just can't acquire it. So I wouldn't want to give the impression that that all of those complaints, apart from 15, were misconceived, because that's not the case. Also, in my annual reports, I always have made clear to the public that there are sometimes matters they bring to my attention that I am not, under the protocol, I'm not going to open an investigation into, but that writing to me about a standards matter is a helpful way for the public to enable me to alert you as members to tell the House what the public care about. Responsiveness to MPs and choice of language, I think, have been in each of my 3 annual reports as things where I don't open investigations, quite rightly so, but the public have an opportunity to talk to write to me, knowing that I will report it to the House for you to take account of it as you want. Then, finally, are there some complaints that get to me because people don't understand enough about what my office is? Yes, there are. Could we be doing more clearly? What have we done? We've improved we've expanded the explanatory material on my webpage so that hopefully people who want to know what is within scope will get a clear picture, but that's something we will keep an eye on. Can I just check whether Helen wants to add anything on that? Yeah.
Okay, and then just a quick follow-up. And in that case, do you have a rough idea of what proportion of those more than the 15 that led to an investigation fall into each of those categories, just so that we can consider and assess whether, as I asked, if there is more that we, the House, you need to do in order. If we're talking about a small number that are just that misperception, then it's not necessarily an area that needs a lot of work. So rough proportions, if possible.
I'm, as you can understand, I'm reluctant to sort of pluck a figure out of the air because I think that might not be helpful. But I think in the spirit of your question, I would say it's a relatively small number of complaints that are wholly misconceived in the sense of just being to entirely the wrong person. And I would also say that one of the functions that we take seriously is if somebody does come to the wrong person, to give them some help to find out where they should go. And we now have on my webpage, there's a list of alternative providers of advice that people might want to look at where I can't help them. There might be somewhere else for them to go. So we're doing our best to redirect. But it's not that, I think that's a relatively small issue.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. If I can move to Sir Francis.
I'm going to ask a couple of questions about your chart on page 26, which is about those cases of the 2,955, where they go if they're not part of the investigations. And just picking up on what I think you were saying then at the end, it's the large category, the third of those, where actually communication should have gone to another body. And I know we've talked about this before, but it's about what can be done to encourage people not to come to you about complaints or communication that you're not going to investigate. So that's the first point. Do you want to answer that, and then I'll come on to the second one?
Yes, thanks. So, again, sometimes the fact that it's for another body to deal with does not mean that I'm not actually quite pleased to hear about it. So this is why I say there's a sort of subset within this 1,223 bubble on page 26. There's a sort of subset. I think I don't know if the committee is planning to ask questions later about the new Ethics Commission, but I think when in the previous committee's landscape report, one of the things that's always concerned you is the complexity of the standards landscape. And I am hopeful that having an overarching ethics commission might be a source of doing some work on pulling those things together. So I don't write all of those 1223 off as useless. Indeed, sometimes I write back to members of the public specifically thanking them for raising issues that I think the House wants to hear about, where we do want to be making sure that people know whether they should be accessing the police, whether they should be accessing other sources of advice. Yeah, that's always work in progress.
The other area I want to just touch on is the 105, and you touched on this in the last response, which are those where there isn't sufficient evidence. And I get that, but are there occasions where you look at what has come in and you think, okay, they haven't given enough evidence, but I'm concerned, and maybe that person hasn't got the opportunity to find the evidence, but I need to do something. So are there circumstances like that? And if so, how do you deal with those ones?
Yeah, there are. And, you know, I do sometimes find those quite concerning. The only specific action that I am empowered under the House's procedures to take in a situation like that is, under the standing order, I have there are two parallel kinds of words, confidential words of advice. One is where I think there has been a breach, or may have been a breach, and the other is where I don't think there's a breach, but I have a concern that I think should be shared with the member. So that I can, on a case that has not been evidenced sufficiently to engage paragraphs 23 and 24 of the protocol to start an investigation, I am able to communicate with the member under the standing order if I think that's appropriate, and I would sometimes do that. That's the only specific action that I can take. I think the other less formal line is one of the things that I will always think where I have a complaint, and I think it is a serious complaint, but there isn't sufficient evidence, is I will sometimes think, is this a matter that members generally need to have more information about and think about? And I do, of course, have the ability to issue an advice note where I can say to members, you know, I haven't started an investigation about, where I haven't started an investigation, I can just say, members, collectively, you might like to think about this particular issue. Yeah. So it's not perfect, but those are the two kinds of things that I can do when that arises.
Do you think there's a gap there, then?
Well, I mean, no, I don't think there's a procedural gap, because, and I think you sort of, you alluded to this at the beginning, it will inevitably, any regulator faces situations where somebody knows they're onto something but they can't get evidence. That's absolutely, that's just the way the world is, I think. So I don't think there's a procedural gap. No. Anything else? Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think there's a follow-up question from Michael McGuire.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Daniel, you mentioned that in the previous committee's landscape report, one of the issues that we put forward to address the complexity of the different regulatory bodies looking at MPs was a front-end portal which would help guide people to the right organisation. You mentioned the Ethics Committee and something that it might be doing. Is that an aspiration? Are you aware that there's work ongoing to do that?
I'm not aware of a specific work stream that they're about to deliver, but it's certainly one of the things that is being discussed. The coordination and public coordination of the ethics system is my understanding is that is one of the reasons why the Commission was established in its present form, and it's certainly one of the things. I attend meetings with the Commission, and that's certainly one of the things we are discussing.
It's more than just a hope?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. If I can turn to the issue of words of advice, my colleague Jill's got some questions on that, Commissioner. Jill.
Thank you for coming today, Commissioner, and I'd like to wish you all a Happy New Year. I did read your report last night. We had a very late night and I had plenty of time to read it, and I did enjoy seeing the things that you were doing for the House. However, your report does not say how many times you've held informal discussions with members or gave formal words of advice about reported attitudes, behaviour or conduct. Without going into individual operational detail, broadly, how many times did you use those powers in the last year or so?
Thanks for that. Yes, and I share your view that this is a useful tool in the range of possible actions available to me, and I think the committee as a whole, in establishing the present system, is of the view that it ensures a proportionate and effective response in the individual circumstances of each matter. And I know proportionality has always been a significant issue for the committee, and it's one that I share. I don't keep or publish a list, as you know, it's not in the annual report, and I think it's quite important to reflect that as this is deliberately under the standing orders a confidential process, I don't sort of say, I don't give information that might lead to identification of individual cases. However, what I've tried to do for the committee in my monthly updates to you is I've, over the last year or so, I've included in the monthly updates a report on the issuance of words of advice, and what I've tried to do there is to give you a general description of the range of matters that have been subject to words of advice, so that in your oversight capacity of my work, you're able to get a feel for how this power is being used. Without being able then to give you an exact number, I think you can sort of get a flavour from the number of different topics that I raise in the monthly reports, the sort of numbers that we're dealing with.
Yeah, do you think it would be useful to us to see those numbers in your annual report?
I think if the committee would like more information about words of advice, then it's certainly something I should take away and think very seriously about, and perhaps it's something we could explore together between now and the time of the next annual report.
Thank you very much for that. And can I just finish off by saying, in broad general terms, which, if any, particular attitudes, behaviour or conduct matters required such intervention?
So I think the most helpful response there is that they are generally, with very few exceptions, they are generally behaviours that are within chapters 1 to 4 of the guide, the guide to the conduct of members, and there are going to be cases, as I said before, where there wasn't evidence, or whether for some reason it's not proportionate or justified to have an investigation, but they're going to be almost exclusively, they will be squarely within those 4 chapters. So to give an example, which again I've recorded in reports to the committee, and I think it may be helpful to say in public, there'll be issues about registration or declaration that clearly fall within the ambit of the power. Would you say that there were many these attitudes, and going back to the numbers again, in that it would be really helpful for us to know how many of our colleagues are finding difficulties? So would it be, can you sort of give us more number sort of based things, so we've got some idea of how many people are reaching out, whether it's a small number or a big number, and whether we should take action to make sure that they don't need to go to you for... Yeah, okay. That's okay. As I say, that's definitely something I would think about, and perhaps talk to the committee about between now and the next reporting occasion, whether I can be more helpful on that. Thank you. Thank you. Anything either of you wanted to add?
Thank you. If we can now move on to the issue of trust in politics, and I'll invite my colleague Neil to ask a question.
Good morning, Commissioner. In your report in the foreword at page 4, you set out that you've raised concerns about what you see as a dangerously low level of trust between the public at large and the political class in general. You then go on at page 37 at paragraph 66 to identify that engagement with the public and aiming to address public disaffection with and disengagement with the political system is a priority within your tenure. One of the issues raised, you spoke about at Keele University, was behaviour at PMQs, for example. Of course, that falls under the procedural protocol, under the ambit of the Speaker opposed to your authority. What factors do you take into account when balancing your role as an impartial investigator of complaints made against members with your public statements about parliamentarians' conduct in matters which go beyond the Code of Conduct, and I'd say specifically issues around behaviour in the chamber?
So my starting point always has to be the standing order that sets me up and sets out what my role is and what my powers are. And one of the issues that the standing order requires me to advise on, including individual members, the House and the committee, is questions of propriety. And that's a very broad phrase. And in my view, one of the purposes of having an independent officer appointed by the House in the way that I am is that I'm able to take a slightly objective look at a general range of behaviours, going back to the question before, a general range of attitudes and behaviours by members. One of my roles is to investigate specific breaches of specific provisions of the Code of Conduct, but I also think I have a wider responsibility to the House to help the House to look at its own behaviour through the prism of the expectations of the public of standards, ethics and propriety of public servants. So when I'm asked a question, I mean, the particular reference to Prime Minister's questions arose because I was asked to give talks, induction talks, to new members of Parliament after the general election. And I asked myself, what can I say to them about the propriety of behaviour of members generally that will help them to enhance trust between the body politic and the members of the public? And based on the number of issues that I receive from members of the public, many of which don't fall within my investigatory role, one of the things I know the public care about is how you treat each other. It is something that is constantly reported to me. And so I think that's helpful for me to say to the House, think about how you look on these occasions. If somebody made a complaint to me about something that was said in the chamber, the procedural protocol is very clear. That is not a matter for me, that's a matter for the Speaker. Mr. Speaker and I share, we discuss general matters of propriety and standards regularly, and we share a common aim to enhance the reputation of the House and to enhance trust between the public and the body politic. So that's really what's in my mind. Does it fall within my wider responsibilities, and is it something that is likely to be helpful to the House?
In his opinion. Thank you, Neil. Gareth, have you got a follow-up?
Just a very quick follow-up question, because I think I entirely understand the point about trying to make sure that we are cognizant of issues of propriety. I'm just conscious that you started a number of your answers by saying by the rules that are governed, you are governed by the rules of the standing orders. The standing orders on these matters are very clear about it. It's about recommendations to this committee, its subcommittees or individual members. I'm just conscious and wondering if there's any rationale for how you square the responsibility under the standing orders to make recommendations to this committee with the very absolute point you make about how we are perceived in public, in public lectures or on Times Radio, when seemingly those matters haven't been brought to us directly as a committee first.
Yes, and I do definitely have a responsibility to advise the committee. I also have responsibility to advise members, other persons or bodies subject to registration. Under Standing Order 150, paragraph 2C, I advise the committee and I advise individual members. So, yes, I definitely have a role to advise the committee, which I hope I'm always happy to supply any advice that the committee requires. I remind the committee that I report to the House. And my annual report, under Standing Order paragraph 6, my annual report is made not to the committee, although I'm delighted that the committee gives me this annual opportunity to discuss it with the Committee on Standards, but it is a report to the House. I am appointed by the House, and ultimately I answer to the House. So I absolutely appreciate the importance of the relationship with the committee as set out in Standing Orders, and I am enormously grateful to the committee for that relationship. I also have a wider responsibility.
Can I tease a little further on that, Chair? So, to take one example, your Times Radio interview, where you gave some pretty forthright opinions on what the hospitality rules should be, and what you would be saying if you were a member of Parliament. Obviously, that is a subject that this committee has been corresponding with you on, and your comments on Times Radio were a clear set of opinions that you have exposed. I'm just conscious where your responsibilities, as you rightly point out, reporting that to the House, extend to offering such forthright opinions that you know are at odds with the views of some members of this committee via national media, and where the Standing Orders underpins that particular level of activity in your role as the Commissioner and as an Officer of the House of Commons.
I appreciate the force of the question. I remind the committee I absolutely did not and would not express a view on what the rules about gifts or hospitality should be. Indeed, I said very clearly that that is entirely a matter for the House and it's a matter to come before the committee. The only opinion I gave was that in my opinion, members should be benchmarking constantly their own views about what the rules should be against the need to enhance trust, which I do not think is a controversial statement to make. I was very clear, and I'm extremely grateful to you for the opportunity to repeat it today, but I was very clear in what I said to the Times, and I'm always clear in what I say in public, that the policy of this is a self-regulating house and must be a self-regulating house for strong constitutional reasons that we all understand. I will never tell the House or the committee what policy it ought to have. I will advise the committee. If I'm asked to advise on the development of policy, I will, but it is always for members to set their own rules, and I apply those rules impartially in accordance with the procedure set out by the House in the procedural protocol.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Commissioner. If we can move on to the next item, which is on advice notes. And the next question is from my colleague, Gareth.
Yeah, it's a similar sort of thing, Commissioner. So looking at that Standing Order 152, and in particular sections B, C and D, obviously advice notes are a tool of your creation to assist members to better understand the code of conduct. Again, I am just conscious that these are documents that you construct and publish to the House, but I am curious which section of Standing Order 150 you are relying on in order to have the authority to produce those particular advice notes and to send them, make them. I appreciate they're not part of the Code of Conduct, but they do give a clear indication of your interpretation of the Code of Conduct. So what the authority is that you derive from 150 to do that?
Yes, thank you. So Standing Order 152C requires me to advise individual members on the interpretation of any code of conduct to which the House has agreed. Now, what tends to happen is this. We as in I and my team and the Registrar and his team, We get a lot of questions from members, and I said before I really welcome that, and the fact that the advice practice has expanded is something I very much welcome. So we will get questions from members about the application of specific issues in specific provisions of the code or guide. I took the view that where I am getting what you might call frequently asked questions, where I'm getting the same question on the same provision quite a lot, rather than responding piecemeal to an individual inquiry, it's helpful to issue in a consistent form advice to all members, and that was the genesis of the advice notes. The first advice note, indeed, arose from a direct request from this committee, well, from the previous Standards Committee, in its first report of session 2022 to 23, where I was asked to advise on wording for a template clause and undertaking to satisfy the new rules on written contracts for outside formal paid employment. So that was the first advice note that I issued, and I have recently revised that advice note to take account of recent developments. The point you made is, I think, if I may say so, particularly important to stress that advice notes do not, and they say expressly that they do not, vary the rules or create new obligations. They are there to support members' compliance with the code and guide, and they are in response to questions that I have received. They're circulated to members when they're issued, and they're also recirculated when they are updated. The feedback from members, and the Registrar may wish to say something about this because he and his team deploy advice notes in response to requests for advice quite frequently. The feedback from members is that they do appreciate the contextual and practical aspects of advice notes. I don't know if the Registrar has anything he wants to add to that.
I think overall that's correct. In the advice that is sought from my office, where you get frequent, a number of requests for advice that hit the same subject, if there's an advice note, it's rather helpful to be able to give them something that has the authority of the Commissioner, and is also just enforces the consistency of the advice that we provide to members.
Could I ask then, in terms of a threshold at which you operate to determine that an advice note is necessary, how many consistent or similar requests would you sort of have in front of you before you thought actually this is something that probably requires an advice note, as opposed to individual and confidential advice to individual members?
It varies. It varies. There have been cases where there might have been a dozen or so. There might have been quite a few. There have been other cases where I've thought to myself, hold on, if even a couple of people are unclear about this, it might be helpful to think about issuing advice. The other thing I should have said in my response to you is that, and I don't know, Chair, if you're going to come on and discuss the Code of Conduct review at some point, but perhaps I can just interpolate this thought briefly.
Please do, yes.
That's very kind. One of because we don't want to overcomplicate the system, I very much don't want advice notes to become an additional series of information, additional pile of documents that everybody has to check. So one of the things that I am doing in preparing my submissions for your Code of Conduct review that you will start in due course is I'm looking at all my advice notes and I'm marking each one either as a recommendation for absorption within the code or guide, where I think it's effectively, there's a little bit missing that is quite helpful to tell members, or where I think it's ephemeral, then I'm identifying in saying I think we can, that does not need to be perpetuated. So the aim is that these are effectively frequently asked questions responses, and that where we can absorb them within the general system, we should do that. The other thing I should just add is, in addition to advice notes, on my web page there are now a small number of explanatory notes, and those are there, again, in the interests of transparency and accountability for the public as a whole, but also for members, to be able to see how I operate. So they're not advice to members, but they are explanations of how I operate. And one example is the relatively new explanatory note on the advice practice, so that people know exactly what advice we are giving under standing orders, what the provisions of the protocol are, how it works, when they can ask the registrar for safe harbour advice, when they can't. So we're trying to give as much information as possible, not just about our advice, but also about how our advice is prepared.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think, is there a follow-up from Michael Maguire?
Yes, thanks, Chair. I'm just interested in your thoughts, Daniel, on what you think, or what weight you think this committee should give when considering a case for members who haven't read or haven't followed your advice notes.
It'll be entirely a matter for you in each case.
Indeed, but I'm interested in your thoughts.
I think the only helpful thing for me to say here is to reiterate advice notes shouldn't become an additional burden on members. They're there to help members. And I certainly would deprecate any presumption that a member is at fault for not having seen that they're... I mean, we're circulating them, so we try and give members the greatest opportunity possible to see them. But I would deprecate any suggestion that there was an advice note, you didn't see it, therefore it must be a breach or something like that. They are ultimately, as Gareth Snell very helpfully mentioned at the beginning of his first question on this, they are only advice, and they're not glossing the code, they don't add to the code, and it is open to a member as it is open to the committee to say to me, you've read my advice and you don't agree with it. So you could have a case where a member would come to you and say, I did read the Commissioner's advice note, I have deliberately and knowingly acted against it, and I ask you, the committee, to affirm that I, the member, are right and not the Commissioner, and that's absolutely fine. So genuinely nuanced, but that would be
that's
what
very helpful.
Thank you,
Sir. That is very helpful, thank you, Commissioner. I have Caris next.
Yeah, thank you for your report. I always find it insightful and interesting. And there was a line in there that particularly resonated for me, which is the opposite of trust is not suspicion, it's disengagement. And in some ways, your report gives me confidence that the public are still engaged and they do raise concerns with you. And I know that you harness those concerns in terms of deciding on which advice notes to write. Do you have a particular, and I think you've started to answer this question, but is there a set criteria to decide this is appropriate topic for advice note and this is not?
I'm afraid I don't think I can do much better than repeat, but perhaps slightly more coherently, what I was trying to say before, which is this. I genuinely am triggered by, is this going to be helpful to members? Are members struggling with a particular aspect that I could just put to rest by issuing a note and telling them this is the position? I mean, I don't know if you want an example.
Set criteria, is it helpful or not?
Genuinely, that is the criterion. Is it? I mean, if you want to give you an example, there was an advice note I issued fairly early on in my tenure about the treatment for the purposes of registration of charitable donations, and that was because I felt there was an absolutely genuine doubt in the minds of certain members as to what the rules required. And it seemed to me, as the Registrar said, it seemed to me it's really important to give consistent advice on that to members. So I thought, you know what, I can put this out in a short form, circulate it to everybody, and then, as well as members knowing where they are, of course, again, in the interests of trust based on transparency and accountability, the public can also see that. So the question for you as a committee will be on what side of the line does that fall between ephemeral and permanently useful, whether to embody it in the code, and I think I will probably be giving you advice on that in the course of my submissions, and you'll ask yourselves, maybe we should put that in the guide next time, and then no one will have that question. But yes, it's absolutely, is this going to help people?
Thank you.
Thank you, Caris. My colleague Vicky's got the next question.
Thank you. Hello, Daniel. You mentioned in your report that you consulted a significant number of named individuals and bodies when you were drawing up your advice notes. Are you able to share or willing to share who you might have consulted and why you chose those in particular?
Could you help me by just reminding me where that is? Because I'm just slightly unsure exactly.
Is it page 45?
45, thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you. Oh right, thanks. Yes, sorry, I'm with you. So the first example, yes, the Judicial Office. So when I was producing, I think my second advice note, the first one was responding to the committee's request for a template. I think it was the second one was on separation of powers and MPs writing to judges. And I consulted it was then the Lord Chief Justice, and now for revisions it's the Lady Chief Justice, and the Judicial Office. And the reason for doing that was that what I was doing in that advice note was the committee had issued a report relating to the action of certain members. And again, very much picking up on the question before, I was asking myself, following that report, will every member reading it know what they can and can't do? And I was concerned that they might not all understand the principles that arose out of the report in that case. Because the essence of that was the separation of powers between Parliament and the judiciary, it seemed very important to me that the judiciary and Parliament were speaking with the same voice on that issue. And therefore I consulted the Lord Chief, and indeed he was kind enough to share some public material that he had produced for the judiciary so that I could embody that in the text of the advice. So that's one example. Forgive me, I don't think I can immediately reel off exactly why each of the other people I've mentioned here was relevant to a particular advice note, but obviously the clerk of the journals is likely to be somebody I consult whenever, for example, there's any issue of Crown Portcullis facilities. That's something that the clerk of the journals has responsibility for. Teams from across the House Service, again, perhaps I can give you an example. I did issue an advice note about the rules relating to hospitality and tours, and I certainly consulted with the relevant team there, partly, again, as the Registrar said, to ensure that we're all giving consistent advice. I think that will that do?
Very helpful, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Next questions are from Michael Maguire.
Thank you, Chair. Just building on what Vicky was saying, you say that you've consulted with other stakeholders other than the named individuals. Who was that, and what was the benefit of that?
I'm struggling a little bit. I may have to write to the committee. I'm struggling to remember specific stakeholders, unless either of my colleagues can happen to remember a particular one. No, I'm afraid I'm struggling to recall. I'm going to have to write to the committee.
Well, given that, and given the kind of the broad range of stakeholders that you consulted with, is there any particular reason why you didn't consult with this committee on the advice notes?
So yes, I took the decision early on, and this is something that certainly we can discuss and we can compare notes on. But I took the decision early on that these are very much intended to be consistent records of advice that I give in accordance with my standing order functions. Now, one of the things that the committee and the House has been very consistent on is the importance of being seen to maintain my operational independence. And the committee on a number of occasions has affirmed the importance of it being seen, and this is because it's really important that although you are a self-regulating house, as I've said, it's very important that members of the public don't feel that members of Parliament are simply marking each other's homework. And my operational independence that the committee gives me is, I think, very valuable in enhancing trust with the public, because they can see that you send me off and you say, do what you want, and so far as possible maintain that independence. I took the view that as these advice notes, as I explained in my first response to Gareth Snell, as these advice notes are embodiments of individual advice I would give to members, in the same way that it would be improper under your arrangements for my independence for me to come to you and say, I'm about to advise member X of Y, you would not want me to do that. I took the view that it would be equally inappropriate to have them approved by you in that form. But I do absolutely take the point that consultation is not the same as approval, and I think that the thought that you've raised is one that I want to think about some more. I think for me, and I believe for the committee, preserving that feeling of independence is very important. Whether that's consistent with some sort of consultation perhaps on some occasions, not others, is something I would like to think about more.
I think, Chair, I mean, the issue of, I absolutely get the issue of operational independence, yeah. And what goes into an advice note is your decision at the end of the day. Absolutely understand that. But at the same time, that doesn't detract from the broader issue of consultation in getting feedback on advice notes or getting feedback from this committee on how they're being implemented. I think is entirely relevant and doesn't in any way impact on your operational independence. So I think there is an issue there which I think we might want to consider at a future point.
Yeah, and particularly as regards how they've worked, I completely agree with that, and I have no difficulty with that at all.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I've got a follow-up from Gareth and then Michael.
I entirely understand and appreciate the importance of the operational independence of the role of the Commissioner and it not being and having the flexibility and the leeway to investigate fairly and freely. I'm just conscious that this and it's a perverse situation, isn't it, Commissioner? You are the regulator of some members of this committee, and in turn, this committee is the oversight body of you as the regulator, and so there is a symbiotic relationship, and I'm just conscious that the balance for that is drawn in a way that balances off. You know, you're absolutely right to investigate and regulate members of Parliament, but that also the way in which you do that and the programmes that you put in place and the processes are also held accountable to this committee as per the standing orders that established the committee. I do wonder though, and it's interesting you said about how you wouldn't bring an individual advice note to this committee for prior sign-off before you gave it to an individual member. Do you then hold that the confidential advice you were able to give to individual members under Standing Order 52, I think it's B, is the same as the advice notes that you issue in general to 650 members, not as individuals, but individually? No, because I think there is a difference between the House as a whole, individual members, and you issuing advice notes to all members as if they were individuals.
Yeah, no, so we have to distinguish here between advice under Standing Order 150, paragraph 2, B and C, and the power under Standing Order 150, paragraph 5. Confidential words of advice is not what we're talking about here. Confidential words of advice, as I explained earlier on in this session, are where a complaint has been made to me or I have considered making an own motion investigation, and I have concluded for the number of reasons, I won't go over what we said before, not to open an investigation. but that I think it is helpful for the member if I indicate concern or give words of advice. That's what that paragraph is about. Advice for under paragraph 2, which includes, by the way, the safe harbour advice, which the guide to the guide to the rules enables the Registrar in most cases and the Clerk of the Journals in respect of the rules relating to the use of house-provided stationery. Those are included under that category. That's advice where we are being asked for either an interpretation or we're being asked to assist the member in making one of the decisions that they have to make about the application of the rule. So those are two separate kinds of thing.
I understand that, but in answer to my earlier question, you said that the authority under which you issue advice notes is, I think you said Standing Order 152C,
Yeah.
which gives you the right to advise the committee, the subcommittee, or individual members,
Yeah.
and that sending things, as you do, you publish them to all members, all
Yeah.
650 of us, as individuals.
Yeah.
You also said, in answer to Michael's question, you wouldn't want to get into a situation where individual advice is sort of pre-authorised by this committee. So,
Yeah.
so what I'm trying to understand is, do you see an equivalence between the individual advice you might give me as a member if I was to come to you and say, I have a question, Commission, you send me a private advice note, versus the broad advice notes that you send to 650 members as individuals, as opposed to making a report to this committee or the House?
Yeah, so the if I get, and this goes back to the question you asked before, if I get the same question or a similar question from a number of members, I may start to think, rather than waiting for every member to spot there's an issue and to come and ask me and get, as you say, a private response, let's put one out to everybody. And so yes, in that sense, I see it just as it's taking all the individual members together and saying, I'm going to give you all advice. There is a distinction, of course, between the confidential advice under B and the advice on C, which is not always necessarily confidential. And I took the view that if I can save members from having to keep asking the same question again and again, and I can ensure that we're giving a consistent advice, then publish it and get it out there.
Thank you. Michael, do you... No, you don't. Okay. Sorry, Sir Francis has got a follow-up.
So just following on from what Michael said, your reflections, and I don't know if this is going to help your reflections, and from that conversation we've just had, I think there's a distinction between giving a member advice about the interpretation, fine, absolutely your remit, compared to, actually there's a gap in the rules, therefore it's more of a policy issue, that you're going to then give some help and guidance about to all members, therefore public. And for me, those might be the ones where you would want to say, actually my interpretation or my filling of the gap might be something that the committee would want to have some oversight or view on. So therefore, those might be the ones you would want to consider as part of the consultation, involving us in the consultation.
Does that help?
No, well, it does. I very much agree with the thrust of that. Except my only hesitation is the premise. I just want to remind us, advice notes should not be filling substantive gaps in the rules. And I believe they don't. They are not there to gloss the rules, and it would be, the rules and the code are set by the House. In the Code of Conduct review, I will be drawing to your attention some gaps that I think you might want to fill. Those are not things on which I would try and fill them with an advice note.
Okay. Maybe I'm misremembering. I just thought I was quoting what you had said earlier in this discussion.
If I used the word gap, I withdraw it, because I certainly did say earlier advice notes are not there to gloss.
An earlier question,
Yeah, okay.
Mindful of time, but Michael and Gareth want to ask further follow-up questions. Is there anybody else on the committee that would like to ask any further follow-ups on this matter? In that case, Michael and Gareth, and then I'll bring this discussion to a close.
Thank you, Chair. And maybe just to sort of slightly step away from the standing orders, never a good idea, I appreciate, but just for the context of the conversation and away from the beginning point, because I accept that advice notes are not to fill gaps, but to move to the end point and how they're used. It's whether you, and I think you have indicated this in a willingness to consider it, it's the practical applications and how it's the end point of the reality of how it's used and the difference between providing advice to an individual member on a confidential basis and that being considered acted upon or not, as you've said, it's just advice, and something that is written down, published and publicly accessible, and whether we want it to be seen as part of the Code of Conduct or rules, which it isn't. The reality is it becomes effectively a reference library and given more credence and is publicly acceptable. So I think it's the whether you see and accept the difference in that, how it has ended up practically being used and seen, and teasing out that difference and then coming back to the conversation as to whether then is therefore a difference in how you interact with this committee between the difference in individual, very private and confidential things and stuff that is written down, published and therefore publicly accessible, and how the approach to drawing up and arriving at those two things might be different, because we obviously accept we wouldn't want to be signing off your conversations with individual members of advice.
No. Well, look, I agree with the suggestion that this is something particularly how advice notes are used and how they're perceived is something that if the committee wants to look at and discuss, I will certainly be very, very, very open to doing that, very happy to do that. And indeed, I would say a bit more than that. I would say that the advice notes, which I think Gareth Snell said, I think you may have used the word invented, but there certainly was an initiative. Yeah, it was certainly something that I initiated. So at present, the protocol is silent about them, and the Code and Guide is silent about them. Now, if the committee feels in the course of its code review that whether it be the standing orders and the nature of advice, whether this is a new kind of animal in the forest that deserves to be recognised and given a little bit more formality as to how it's produced, how it's treated, that's something that the committee might want to do, and obviously I will definitely stand ready to assist the committee in that as you look at it.
Thank you, that's very helpful. Gareth's withdrawn. Commissioner, if I can move on now to naming members under investigation as a topic. I've got a couple of questions from Rosemary and David. Rosemary.
Yeah, thank you, and good morning, Commissioner and team. And as I say in Scotland, a good new year to one and all. Nice to see you. I always read your annual report with interest. I think there's so much in it. It would be really good to actually just sit down for even longer, I think, to go through it. But I'm going to ask just very specifically, I think, about one issue, and as the Chair has said, around naming members under investigation. And you've said at page 14 and 16 of your annual report, it's a balancing act. A balancing act between openness and reputational impact, and I absolutely get that. It's quite a difficult balance. And you've also said, I think it's helpful, that we've moved quite a few times on this area and you are going to look at it again in their 5-year review of the Code of Conduct. So I think that's really helpful. But to help us think about that as we go through there, could we ask you what representations have you received about not publication names of members while investigation is underway but before a finding has been made? Have you had a lot of people say to you, this is not fair, this is a reputational risk?
I don't think I have. I couldn't promise I haven't received anything, but I don't think I've had a significant body of representations. But I wouldn't attach any significance to that because I've never put out any sort of call for evidence yet. This is something when the committee starts its code. My purely anecdotal experience is that this is something that concerns members, and I mean there are a couple of occasions, as you know, there's a power in the protocol. I think it's paragraph 123 from memory of the protocol that I am allowed in certain circumstances to permit a member to publish a rebuttal of a factually inaccurate report. Now, I think I'm right in saying that I have used that at least once in my time. Yes. And that in itself, if you're asking for sort of evidence of disqualification, for me, to have to allow a member to publish one statement rebutting a factually inaccurate press report of an investigation is already that's too many, even if it's just one. Members of Parliament, your reputation is so precious to you. It is the stock in trade of a member of Parliament, and I think we can't really think too carefully about how we affect this balance between important transparency and not allowing members to be unfairly traduced, which is what it amounts to. So I haven't had a large body of representations, but that I don't think one should draw any conclusions from that. I will be including some thoughts on this for the committee in my submissions, and it's something I hope we'll look at. You're right, we've sort of moved backwards and forwards over time, but I'm afraid I think it's something we should look at again.
Thank you. And just as a slight follow-up, Commissioner, I suppose, in your opinion as Commissioner, does the publication of the members under investigation but not found help or hinder trust in Parliament and politics generally?
Are you talking about where I don't uphold an investigation? So I hope that improves trust, because so just to be clear, we're talking about a situation where there was evidence. I thought it was justified and proportionate. I open an investigation. I then receive other evidence that shows that there in fact was not a breach, and I close down the investigation on a not upheld basis. I hope that will improve trust. I mean, you have to ask the public, but I hope that shows we're not afraid, or I'm not afraid, to admit that what I thought, there was sufficient evidence to open an investigation, so I thought it might go in one direction, but the evidence has shown me, the full evidence has shown me that there wasn't a breach. I hope that shows that I'm not afraid to make a decision based on the evidence.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Back to Chair.
Thank you, Rosemary. David.
Thank you, Commissioner, and good morning. Can I join you in your comments of commendation for your team and the work that they've done, and also for just the general business of the office? I note that your staff costs have remained pretty much constant over the last 3 years, which is in the scope of where everywhere else I'm involved in seems quite remarkable. So congratulations on that. We're talking about the anonymity or otherwise and naming of MPs during investigation. Of course, anyone subject to an investigation by the Independent Complaints and Grievance Scheme is given the opportunity of anonymity during that investigation. So we have a difference there. Do you think that's fair?
I think that when you come to consider this in the course of the code review, I think there are factors that could lead you to believe that ICGS cases, just for public clarity, we're talking there about bullying and harassment or sexual misconduct cases, there are factors that might lead you to believe that confidentiality is more relevant or is more required there than it is in all code cases. But when I say you might think there are factors that way, I mean that you might decide to move more towards equiparating the two systems, and that will be a matter that will be a decision for you. I think perhaps to try to be helpful, I think we should certainly be able to feed in some interesting evidence from the experience of confidentiality in relation to the ICGS that may help you in your deliberations when you're looking at confidentiality of code cases.
I wonder whether there may be cases in the course of your investigations where you think it might be more appropriate for a name to be withheld from the public, in a similar manner to the perhaps appropriateness of the ICGS anonymity.
Well, certainly one of the many options available to you that I will draw to your attention when I make my submission on the code review. One of the many options would involve giving the Commissioner a discretion in either direction. You could start with a presumption either way, and you could give the Commissioner a discretion. I can immediately see difficulties with that, as can you, but I can also immediately see that there are some attractions of that. So I think that is definitely one of the options to look at. Thank you.
Again, I'm mindful of time. We're coming to a close. Ministerial Code and Alignment of Publication at Caris.
I'm very interested in the progress in terms of aligning the publication of ministerial interests and the financial interests of members of the House. I would appreciate an update, but also, is there anything the committee can do to support you? Because I think it's a shared aspiration we have.
Thank you. There has been no progress since I last reported that there had been no progress. I am as concerned by that as you are. The one thing I would say is that I mentioned before the creation of the Ethics and Integrity Commission and the opportunities that it provides for overarching thought on these matters, and that is certainly an example of, it's a specific example of one of the matters that I will be looking to discuss with the Ethics and Integrity Commission, with a view to looking at particularly your predecessor committee's Standards Landscape Report of May 2024, paragraph 136, where you drew attention to the inconsistency between the amount of detail required to be supplied in ministerial data and that in equivalent categories which have to be declared in the Commons Register, and the inconsistencies in timeliness of the publication of departmental transparency returns compared to the Register, both being issues which the Committee on Standards in Public Life, which was the forerunner of the Commission, have acknowledged. And so the only thing I can report in response to your question today is an intention to raise that in that context with the Commission.
Is there anything we can do to support you?
Yes, it's really helpful that you raise this every time you do, and I don't mean that, and I'm not saying that in any sense, in any sense other than genuine. That's not meant to. I mean genuinely that when you are kind enough to raise this in public, it enables me to go to the opposite numbers in the Cabinet Office, the Registrar, to speak to his opposite numbers and say, yeah, this is a matter of concern to the House. And I also think it's very important, the landscape report was about trust and how, complicating factors and differences, unexplained differences in reporting cycles, they do damage trust. So yes, please don't let me off the hook, so to speak, and I am doing what I can. I have not achieved anything so far.
Okay, thank you. I'll ask the same question again next year.
I hope not. I hope by then it'll have gone away, but I fear that we'll see where we are.
Thank you. I've got a follow-up from Michael.
Daniel, why do you think progress has not been made? And who do you think it would be helpful to bring in front of this committee to move this process forward?
I think there are a number of people who do occasionally come before the committee to whom you could helpfully ask that question. It is ultimately a governmental question. You do have ministers appear before you from time to time, and you obviously be able to ask them. I'm not going to speculate on why they might not have been able to deliver. There may be genuine practical difficulties, and it would be wrong for me to say that there aren't. And honestly, that's not something that I can help you on.
Okay. Thank you. Are there any other questions that members have in respect of the Commissioner and his team in respect of their annual report? No. Commissioner, do you or any member of your team want to say any further comments in respect of your annual report during this public session?
No. Thank you, as always, for giving me the opportunity to come and speak to you.
Thank you very much. Order or